Berlin, and thank you, of course, to the Baran Initiative for inviting me. As Lynn has already alluded to, I want to look a little bit at the broader global situation on the basis of what was actually the long-term strategy of these terror groups. Dr. Niloufar has called the militant groups. I think there's no need to make them sound less threatening that they are terror groups, and they have not changed their ideology because the strategy is actually working. What was the innovation that modern Islamist terrorism in the form of Al-Qaeda and then in the second form of IS actually postulated? The postulation was, if there is a sufficient time, a sufficient amount of attacks on Western interest or Western targets, both in the foreign countries as well as in the West itself, the West will lose economic, political, and military interest in the regions where we are present. And once they withdraw, we will be able to take over power. Now, in Kabul, that worked like a charm. We weren't even out of Kabul yet when the Taliban were back. And it was not just the Taliban being back, it is the same individuals that the international community and the Afghan forces threw out of their positions in Kabul in 2002. So there could not have been a more 180-degree turnaround in the situation in Afghanistan possible, even imaginable. This, however, was only the starting point. We are now looking at a ISIL and Al-Qaeda network that is significantly stronger than it's ever been. Everyone focused on the defeat of the physical caliphate in 2019, and that was a success of counterterrorism operations. However, very currently, we're facing the possible imminent takeover of the capital of Bamako, of Mali, by the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jinim, which also already controls 65% of neighboring Burkina Faso. The Islamic State Sahel province, as well as the Islamic State West Africa province, are increasingly operating in Niger, in Mali, as well as in Nigeria, and breaking out of their contained areas. We also have a situation in East Africa that Al-Shabaab is several kilometers from the capital of Mogadishu. So if things go very badly, we will have Al-Qaeda not running one country, but two countries directly in the very near future, i.e. within a couple of months. That all for the background that in Afghanistan, we still have the situation that Al-Qaeda has 100% and all of its affiliates 100% protection by the Taliban. The TTP is only the most obvious example of this. While ISKP has now been responsible for several successful terror attacks, most spectacularly the attack on the Moscow theater in spring 2024, but also the Solingen knife attack. It inspired the New Orleans attack in December 2024, and it was responsible for initiating, instructing, and coordinating numerous attacks, most famously also the luckily prevented attack against the Taylor Swift concert in Vienna. None of this, however, changes the what I would only call very active disinterest of the European as well as the US administrations on the situation in South Asia. The shock of what happened in Afghanistan, the abject failure of anything that was tried in the last 20 years, going away within hours of us deciding to leave the country, sits very, very deep. And despite this enormous amount of terrorism growth, not just in your region, but also in Africa and in the Middle East, and the fact that we in Syria now have a former Al-Qaeda leader being the interim president, and Al-Qaeda elements being part of its administration, none of this conjures up enough political will to not deal just with the largest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War in Ukraine, not just to focus on the situation in the Middle East and Gaza, but also to recognize that Islamist international terrorism is back, and that we have in Afghanistan the very same people doing the very same things that they did in the late 1990s, with the very same groups that they did that in the late 1990s, where we also told ourselves collectively that this is a foreign problem and not our problem, with very well-known results. I'm speaking from New York. This city knows what the results were. So
Mm.
unfortunately, I don't have good news. I do not see that this situation is going to change very quickly, despite the fact that you had this massive spike in attacks in Pakistan year on year. I mean, we are still, my organization monitors everything that ISIL Al Qaeda does in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Year on year is about 100%. Every year, 100% more attacks in Pakistan than there were the year before. It is still seen as a very regional problem. The only engagement that the European governments at the moment are actually actively pursuing is to find some kind of unofficial deals with the Taliban regime in Kabul to extradite migrants that have become perpetrators of criminality in Europe in order to stem the rise of right-wing populist parties all over Europe. That's where we are. I unfortunately cannot see that this is going to turn around. So there was a lot about the designs that America has for the region in the first two presentations of what was mentioned. I wish it would have designs. Unfortunately, the resources are gone. The strategic thinking is gone. Not only from this administration, I would postulate that any other alternative US administration would take a very equally disinterested look, unfortunately, at this region. It will come at our peril, I'm sure. I've been through this
Mm.
in the 1990s. I've been arguing against finding moderate Taliban already in the 1990s with the European governments when I was still a government official, but we have the very same discussions now. So I really don't know how this situation can be ameliorated, but we are concentrating, as far as I can see, as far as the US and Europe is concerned, when it comes to terrorism defense, on domestic terrorist defense. And we are very, very, very hesitant to do any multilateral, overseas, larger scale counterterrorism operations anytime soon, this year or in the coming years. Sorry that I don't have any better news, but it's no point in sugarcoating things.
Well, no, indeed. I think anyone who came here today for good news was severely delusional. I'm very grateful to you for your roundup, Hans. Do you think that well, I'd like to know, especially given what we've heard from Niloufar and from Mohsin, that we're looking at the exponential growth, not only of attacks, but also of the number of people who will be looking for the $20 to pick up an AK-47 and shoot it in that direction because there isn't any alternative. So why do you think that being told, even though we're being told constantly by people like us here on this group panel today, um, uh, what the reality is, that the international community is largely overlooking or at the very least underestimating the scale of the threat? What do you put that down to?
I mean, first of all, I fully agree with the assessment that extraditing an extraordinary amount of Afghan refugees back into Afghanistan is just about the worst idea you could have if you want to stem the tide of extremism and terrorism. I have not seen the Taliban regime being even interested or willing to set up the necessary programs to give economic opportunities, which of course then leaves a lot of opportunities for terrorist organizations for recruiting this. And they
Mm.
are very obviously using this. The disinterest, I'm afraid, of the international community, in particular the European and the North American governments on the situation in the region, is unfortunately the result of the strategy working. Unfortunately, it seems that Osama bin Laden had a point where he said, if we tire the West out long enough, it will withdraw and it will not come back. I'm afraid we're
Mm.
seeing this. The situation may change when, if there is a large scale additional migration problem or a large scale terror attack anywhere in North America and Europe. But look, we had the largest number for German standards, largest number of terror attacks since the Second World War between May 2024 and May 2025. 9 successful terror attacks and dozens of disrupted terror attacks in the country. But that just didn't change the appetite for overseas counterterrorism operations. There are now various domestic procedures and legal arrangements that are changed as a result of this, but no one is even beginning to discuss that counterterrorism support for the states bordering these countries where these groups are operating or in part taking over That's just not on the cards right now. I put this down to what I call the Afghanistan trauma. 20 years with absolutely no result whatsoever.
Mm. Well, what do you see as being the long-term implications of the Taliban's protection of several Al-Qaeda aligned groups operating in Afghanistan, and also the possibly a couple of dozen of, and I would imagine the number is growing, of training camps operated by Al Qaeda? It's a back to the future situation where these people coming in from Pakistan as refugees, as well as the militants from the Sahel and elsewhere, are channeling through. Where do we go from this realistically,
So,
nihilistically?
yeah, so since Al Qaeda has not changed its ideology, since the impression, and we, as I said, we monitor their discussions online quite intensively, since in their
Mm,
mind the strategy is actually working, it is only a matter of time until we not only seeing ISKP inspiring and guiding terror attacks in the West, but also Al Qaeda again. One has to ask the question, what are these Al Qaeda groups in these camps actually training for? With the exception of the TTP, none of them are operating regionally, yet they continue to train in these camps in Afghanistan.
yeah.
And obviously, the only conclusion one has to come to is that they are training to fulfill what their ideological postulate is. That means more attacks on the West. At the
Mm,
moment, it still seems that the Taliban leadership has asked them not to embarrass themselves by conducting a terror attack in the West that clearly emanates back to Afghanistan. But that's just a matter of time. I think this is the last card that the Taliban hold in their negotiations with the European governments to say we're holding back Al Qaeda from attacking you in your homeland. And therefore, you will have to recognize ourselves. So sooner or later, the really difficult question for the European governments is going to be, are we walking towards a de facto recognition of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan for the price of actually being able to extradite criminal migrants back into the country? Or are we holding the line? I see the line slipping. I'm sure it's not really widely known, but the German government just handed over the Consulate General of Afghanistan in Bonn to the Taliban. So I can see this not as an official, we are recognizing this as the legitimate government. After all, it's not really been elected, nor does the Taliban regime, as you would expect from Islamist terror organization, extremist organization, interested in any time having any kind of elections. And it still has
mm,
the same attitude, of course, feeling itself part of a wider global Islamist movement, not directly, but certainly through its proxies. For Pakistan, that means TTP. For China, that means the TIP. And for the West, that means pretty much everyone else that they are actively protecting.